Jonathan Lee, the author of Afghanistan, A History from 1260 to the Present. Welcome and thank you for accepting Afghanistan Society's invitation.
Oh, thank you very much indeed. Appreciate that. And I hope I can be some informative in what we talk about.
I think, first of all, congratulations for getting such a sizable and impressive book published.
Yes, it was a bit of a miracle, to be honest. Yeah, it's always the same, isn't it? You're never quite sure whether the publisher's going to accept it or whether they're going to have to cut it quite dramatically. So, yes, I'm very pleased with the way Reaction did it. Been very supportive, actually.
I mean, first of all, why don't you tell us a little bit about the idea? How did this book come about? What led you to it?
Well, it's quite a long story. Initially, the momentum for it came actually when I was approached actually by Reaction and asked whether I'd be interested in contributing a book on the history of Afghanistan for one of their series on the histories of nations. And I kind of was a bit reluctant initially, and then I thought, well, I'd been talking a lot for quite a number of years about the need for a new approach to historiography of Afghanistan and to bring things up to date and into the modern debates on the idea of what actually was Afghan history and trying to free it to a degree from, if I can say it, from the shackles of both the colonial discourse and the focus on just the wars and the diplomacy, but also to re-examine the whole issue of Afghan nationalism and its emergence. So I decided in the end that I would undertake it because that's something that needed to be done and I wanted to do. Having said that, of course, once always sort of thinks, oh, I can have this done in 2 to 3 years, but actually it was a decade in the making. It was a bit of a challenge, to say the least, because the more one got into the subject, the more one decided that you needed to dig further and do more research.
Very well done. I mean, the book, for people who have read about Afghanistan, offers new analysis and it sheds new light on some of the historic events. I think one of these analyses has led in the book to a conclusion that the rise of the Durrani Empire leads to the end of the Afghan rule in northern India. Please tell us a bit more about this.
Yes, it's a kind of strange thing, really, because the empire of Ahmed Shah, in a sense, was I don't know how much it was in Ahmed Shah's mind and idea, but in a sense, this whole engagement with North India, trying to recreate or turn the clock back to the Sultanate period when Afghans, the Lodis, and the Ghilzais, the Khaljis, were ruling Delhi, whether this was still something that was still very much embedded in the mind of Ahmed Shah, or whether he was just merely trying to repeat the conquests of his mentor Nadir Shah. I don't know, but I think there is that element of trying to hark back to perhaps almost an idealized idea of Afghan sovereignty over northern India, or whether it was just purely competition with the Mughals. So I think that's something I raise in the book, and with many things in the book, in a sense, I've raised the questions and posed a lot of questions and tried to answer some of them, but in many ways, I think it's just a start rather than, a terminus.
Another question you raise, which is again quite new, at least it was new to me. I think it was that Ahmad Shah Durrani's invasion of India and his army's conduct led to the rise of a very formidable Sikh power.
Well, there's so many ironies in the whole thing. The demise of the Mughal Empire seems to be also linked to particularly to the invasion of Nadir Shah and the subsequent sort of second wave of conquest that came under Ahmed Shah. And certainly that weakened the Mughals' ability to resist or to maintain its independence. Of course, you have to take also into account the fact that the Marathas were also challenging Mughal power. But in many ways, there was not really an attempt to try and revive the Mughal Empire. It was more a raid in strength, it seems. And the very fact that the Mughal Emperor faced all these invasions from both internally but also from externally from Persia and from Afghanistan pushed them more into the camp of the East India Company, which was the only potential power that was able to counteract these invasions. And so we find this alliance going on with the Mughals protecting their back, as it were, in Bengal, and doing this deal with the East India Company and essentially surrendering most of northeastern India into the hands of the East India Company. So I think that there is a very close relationship between the invasions of Nadir Shah and Ahmed Shah and the rise to political and military power of the East India Company.
And how about Ranjit Singh and the forces, the Sikh forces under him?
I think, again, the rivalry between the Sikhs and the Afghans, that war that was going on for at least 60, 70 years, certainly undermined both the power of the Durrani kingdom, of the nascent Durrani kingdom, and also facilitated the pushing of British power and influence towards the Indus because of the alliance that was forged with the Sikhs and the treaty where initially it was the Sikh kingdom that was the buffer that protected the East India Company from possible threats from invasion from Persia and from Afghanistan and Central Asia. So the rivalry there was also part of the mechanisms whereby the East India Company extended its influence into the Punjab. I think also the rivalry between the Sikh and Afghan kingdoms, and particularly Dost Muhammad Khan, had obviously quite an important impact, obviously, in the evolution of the scenarios that led up to the first Afghan war, with Britain supporting the Sikhs and the Sikh alliance against Dost Muhammad Khan, and not being even prepared to even consider entering into any kind of sort of mediatory role in trying to bring an end to this long-standing war and confrontation for fear of upsetting Ranjit Singh.
I mean, the other question which I had in my mind since I read the book was basically to ask you, how would you compare in that sense, given that the Durrani Empire basically sowed the seeds of its own demise right from the outset with its own conduct? How would you compare that with the Ghaznavid kind of empire that was before it?
Oh gosh, that's a big question. Going forward a bit, there was in the sort of at the 1930s and 40s this attempt to try and almost annex the Ghaznavid history to sort of the Durrani bandwagon by trying to associate the dynasty in Afghanistan with the Ghaznavids, which is some rather ironic because one was a Turkic and the other one was probably a Persianate or a dynasty, or which claimed to have this roots in Pashto society. I don't think there's a great deal of comparison other than the fact that both the Ghaznavids and Ahmed Shah and his successors sought to invade India and try to carve out an empire and maintain it. There are also a lot of differences. The Ghaznavids created a culture which engaged with poetry, which made incredible buildings, its architecture. It's more famous for that, in a sense, historically, than for its invasions and its conquests of India and its Islamization. I think with someone like Ahmed Shah, as I say, he destroyed more than he built. And there was not really an attempt at what we might call Islamization. He was invited in at one point to come and save the Mughal Empire from destruction, yet there was no real organized attempt at Islamization or re-Islamization. It was more conquest, an attempt to try and defeat the non-Muslim powers that challenged the Mughal Empire and that also might threaten his own nascent empire. With the Ghaznavids, I mean, there was a deliberate attempt at Islamization. I mean, you look at the invasion of the mountain area, the area of Bodghis and Rajasthan and so on, and Lahore. And there, Sultan Mahmud actually sent in mullahs. They set up institutions like madrasas and sent in preachers to actually Islamize the whole area. We don't find that, as far as I can see, with Ahmed Shah. It just seems to be invasions, more about power, more about loot, perhaps, than about trying as a deliberate attempt to Islamize or re-Islamize the area. More about perhaps sovereignty than about ideology.
There is some kind of amazing contrast, as you said, the legacy of the Ghaznavid Empire lives on. You know, we've got the Shahnameh from that period, we've got Nasir Khosrau's travel book and Diwan from that period, we've got Ibn Sina from that period, we've got Al-Biruni. That kind of legacy didn't come about with the Durrani Empire.
Well, that's true. And I mean, there's a great talk about the poetry that Ahmad Shah wrote, but I mean, compared to the heritage of the Ghaznavids, as you say, I mean, it's literature, it's poetic traditions, it's architecture, and also the way in which it actually we changed the whole ideological face of the region with a deliberate program of Islamization. That's in many ways a major achievement. Certainly, with the Durrani Empire, we don't seem to have that at all. The literature is fairly thin. The architecture is mostly cut and paste from North Indian architecture. There doesn't seem to be any real attempt to create a culture around the empire. But then Ahmed Shah's empire was very brief in many ways. It was falling apart even before he died. And after his death, of course, we have this bitter civil war that breaks out that just rumbles away well until the mid 1820s, by which time the Sadozai kingdom was in tatters, and most of the gains of Ahmed Shah had been lost due to all the competition between various rival siblings for the throne of Kabul and Peshawar. So it is a very different kind of empire. It's a very different kind of culture, I think. And as you say, I mean, with the Ghaznavids, we're talking one of the great major Islamic kingdoms and cultures of the pre-Mughal era.
How do you compare the two in terms of resources? You know, for instance, the 17th, 18th century Afghanistan did not have the sort of resources internally inside its own borders to fund the empire and kind of the courts, etc., etc. Whereas in that respect, the Ghaznavid kind of empire seems to have been a lot more successful. Where did they get their resources from?
Well, it seems to be a lot of it was in forms of tribute, but also in terms of loot. Some of it of which Ahmed Shah had acquired from Nadir Shah in Kandahar. When he arrives in Kandahar, he is fortunate in intercepting this huge caravan carrying the annual tribute, I think it is, of Kalat. And that really gives him the money, the financial clout in order to essentially pay loyalties and buy loyalties in the area. There's not really doesn't seem to be a real great attempt to actually create a proper fiscal base for the kingdom, which I think is in contrast to when Nadir Shah took Kandahar. He began to reorganize the whole kind of agrarian base and the tax base of the area. I don't know with Ahmed Shah whether one can say that he did that. He seemed to be so occupied with the various wars and various campaigns that he was hardly ever in Kandahar. And when he was in Kandahar, he was often facing challenges to his own rule. So it seems that the fiscal foundation of Ahmed Shah's kingdom was essentially from tribute realized as a result of his conquest, plus the fairly substantial amounts of loot that was acquired particularly in his North Indian campaigns. And I mean, you know, he extracted large amounts of money even from the Mughal emperor in order not to sack the city again, sack Delhi. So I think more probably needs to be done about looking at the whole reign of Ahmed Shah, how his kingdom functioned financially, how his political arrangements. Generally speaking, he tends to be somebody who's not been studied very much. There's a lot of talk about his so-called election in 1747, his rise to power, and huge amounts about his conquest, but there's very, very little discussion or study of his internal policies and the internal workings of the kingdom. And in that sense, we don't really know, as far as I know, very much been written about that whole aspect of Ahmed Shah's kingdom.
Coming back to the book, I mean, you told us a little bit about the beginning, but you know, how long was it in the Genesis? And you know, it must have required piles and piles of sources. How did you access all of those sources?
Well, it wouldn't be something that I could come to just completely green, as it were. I mean, I've been studying the sources for Afghanistan's history since I was an undergraduate. So we're talking about back into the 70s. And I spent a lot of time in the 80s and 90s working through the India Office records for my earlier book on the history of northern Afghanistan and its incorporation into the Afghan state. So I had a good foundation in those sources, and the India Office records is still very much a go-to source. But also, I brought I think my own personal experience, having lived in Afghanistan for many years and traveled extensively through rural parts of the country, and later in the 90s and onwards, working with different aid agencies as a consultant in rural areas, meeting with village leaders and just ordinary people, talking to them about their perceptions of their history. And that has been quite a stimulus for me, because it has revealed to me that there's a very different story to the official story of Afghanistan's history. And so I am able to bring those perceptions into something like the book that I've just written, and that gives a new slant on the way in which Afghanistan was created, on the Durrani dynasty itself and its policies and its evolving nationalism. And one kind of finds through that there's very much a sort of another discourse going on underneath that which the state wants to promote. And also the same with the colonial histories, that reading the original dispatches, you find that there's very often a somewhat different story to the official version of history that the British colonial administrators wants to portray. It's not quite as heroic as they like to think it was. It's very often it was pretty nasty and quite vicious, some of the infighting that went on, and the blame game as senior officials, military and political, try to save their own careers at the expense of other people. And the classic one, of course, is the first Afghan war, with the blame going on Burns and McNaughton, and basically officers who couldn't answer the charges against themselves because they'd been killed. Whereas the people who were responsible for the policy in Britain managed to mostly survive and carry on their political careers, and even end up with towns and cities called after them in the colonies.
Indeed. I mean, one last question, Jonathan, if I may. What was the most surprising thing that you found in the sources that you came across?
I think two things that struck me and that changed my view of things was reading about the rise of the Sadozai kingdom. How this obscure and very minor, impoverished clan of the Abdali tribe managed in the space of about 200 years to come out of obscurity to end up founding an empire. That story of the rise of the Sadozais under the patronage of the Safavids was something that blew my mind away. The more I read about it, the more I realized that here's a secret history that had never been written, really, texts which had never been really engaged with, and one has to thank some very bright Pakistani scholars for digging those out. That was certainly something that was a revelation the more I read into it, to realize how much the founding of the Durrani kingdom was dependent on the patronage of the Safavid Empire. And of course, that raises all kinds of questions about the relationship and the Safavids and its militant Shiism and what the relationship was there. So that was certainly one thing, and more needs to be done on that. And there must be sources in Persia, in Iran, maybe in Isfahan or Mashhad, that could throw more light on that. I think the other major, not shock, but the other major thing you can realize is the more I looked at the whole evolution from the early 20th century of the idea of Afghan nationalism, the more I came to see how inappropriate it was, and also how much it was imposed from the outside or it's an outside ideology being imposed on Afghans. So the latter part of the book is really challenging this whole Tazi's view of what it means to be a citizen of Afghanistan. His Afghania, the idea of the conflation between Pashtun identity and Afghan national identity, which becomes conflated with the whole idea of the loyalty to the Durrani monarchy, which is a kind of a real tortured mix of different ideologies, mostly imported from Turkish nationalism, but which wouldn't engage with some of the more radical elements of Turkish nationalism, which was the disestablishment of Islam, the removal of the caliphate, a secular state. So in a sense, that tension between sort of Western orientated nation state, which is based on an ethnocentric nationalism, and the idea of, as a Mohammed Tazi, trying to uphold the dynasty to which he was directly related and into which he had intermarried. And I think those tensions still remain in Afghan society. I mean, the debate on what it is to be an Afghan, what the nationality issue, all these things have come to the fore as a result of the Soviet invasion and the post-2002 intervention and the debates that have been going on in Parliament. So those issues still seem to remain unsolved, and perhaps also have contributed to the dysfunctioning of the current Afghan government.
Jonathan Lee, thank you very much. Great pleasure having you.
Well, thank you very much, and I hope that it will be of some use.